Welcome back to APUSH for All. This is our fifth and final episode, although we've got another special episode coming your way. So look out for that. What should we call it? A special guest episode?
Yes, this is our fifth and final content episode, but we will have a very special last minute sixth episode with a guest.
So it's a little teaser,
Ooh.
just to get you excited.
When you first said welcome back, it sounded like you were about to sing. You were warming up.
Kind of was
You're
like the welcome back, Mr. Cotter.
it was no, you know what it was? It was Emerson Lake and Palmer. It was welcome back, my friends, to the store, the show that never ends.
I'm sure our audience knows exactly
Yeah.
what you're talking
Yeah. If you're a man of a certain age, you
That
know.
reference
Okay.
hit hard.
Boom. Okay.
But this is our, as Ms. Keltner said, our final content review episode for AP US history. We're covering everything from
1920.
as I
Welcome
said,
back, my friends, to the show that never ends.
as I've said before, as a child, I had a speech impediment. I've always been proud that I've been able to overcome that. Sometimes bullies, just kids, listeners, sometimes bullies will try to bring you down, but you can't let them. You got to keep going.
Wow.
Okay, so we're covering everything from 1920 through today.
Nailed it.
A century marked by roaring change, hard-fought civil rights, cold and hot wars, and the evolving role of government in American life. Today's major themes will be cultural conflict and economic transformation, the rise of the United States as a global superpower, the long struggle for civil rights and equality, political and economic shifts going all the way from FDR to Reagan and up to modern day. So let's get started. How about the Roaring 20s? Here we come.
I see what you did with the roaring change.
Thank you.
Let's get started. That was supposed to be a roar from Mr. Hill.
It's like a lion roar on the Serengeti. Okay.
Okay, so the 1920s saw booming industry, mass consumerism, and cultural tension. And while cities were really embracing new things like jazz, flappers, and automobiles, rural Americans clung to tradition. And conflicts really defined this decade between kind of modernists, people who were embracing change after World War I, and traditionalists who favored more of the past. And so you see these conflicts through prohibition, which is something that is, finally achieved by people who had been in this temperance movement since the 19th century. This is achieved through the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. It makes the sale of alcohol illegal. This leads to organized crime. Another conflict, the Scopes trial. This was a fight between modernists who wanted to teach, science through an evolutionary lens and more traditionalists who wanted education to be focused on religion. Also, the resurgence of the KKK and new anti-immigrant sentiment, another rise of nativism. And finally, you have a big change with the Harlem Renaissance and growing Black cultural influence.
Then came the Great Depression in 1929, stock market crash, bank failures, unemployment soared. It didn't roar, it soared.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? FDR said famously, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself."
That was a good FDR.
That wasn't bad.
That was good.
So FDR's New Deal brought massive government intervention, and that's the key, right? It's a shift toward an overwhelming government influence in American life. We've got public works, Social Security, financial regulation. Now, critics said it went too far. Others that it didn't go far enough, but regardless, it redefined the federal government's role in American life.
So I think it's always a good idea to have some New Deal programs in your back pocket if you should need them for any SAQs, DBQs, LEQs. So I think really important ones would be like the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put young men back to work in order to make a wage and send it home so that their families could spend it, because that's the whole point of, reviving the economy, is that people have to start spending, but to do that, they have to have money. So that's one. That's the relief, right? Immediate relief, getting money into people's pockets so they can spend. A reform, or I'm sorry. Let's do recovery next, which would help an industry. That would be something like the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which provided electricity to people in the South. Another one could be the National Labor Relations Board, which tried to calm relationships between businesses, the federal government, and workers. And then finally, something that was a reform that tried to make sure this never happened again would be like the Social Security Administration. So ensuring that there is welfare, that there is some sort of safety net for the elderly or for the disabled. And also things like the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insures people's bank deposits to make sure that, if there would be another run on the banks in the future, that the federal government would have, a certain amount of money saved for you so that you wouldn't lose your life savings.
I think the FDIC is a really good one because you can talk about the cause, bank failures, and the number one thing that FDR wants to try to address when he becomes president is, how do I restore confidence back in banks? And so, boom, FDIC is the effect of this nonchalance about whatever the banks want to do with your money. So the FDIC. So it's a good bookend. It's like a cause and effect thing.
Yeah, and then I would say finally, be sure to remember that you may be asked to identify the change that occurs from the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, to the Great Depression, and the New Deal itself represents a complete reversal of the laissez-faire politics that we see of the Roaring Twenties. Instead, now we have government intervention. And this, whether or not this was an overwhelming success, what matters most off is it changed the relationship forever and will lead to World War II.
Yes, and if you're looking for a continuity, though, as well, you could relate the New Deal back to the progressive era, because the progressives, they kind of cracked the door open for the government stepping in to solve social and economic problems, and FDR with his New Deal is just going to kick that door wide open.
So in the 1930s, Americans leaned toward isolationism. But World War II pulled the U.S. in after Pearl Harbor in 1941. The war effort mobilized the economy and workforce, women in factories, Japanese Americans in internment camps, and African Americans in the Double V campaign.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on, in the various theaters of World War II and also on the home front. So the US is going to play a crucial role in defeating the Axis powers, because not only are we fighting a two-front war, we're actually fighting a two-theater war in the European theater against the Germans and the Italians, and in the Pacific theater against the Japanese. But in 1945, the war is going to end. In both theaters. In May of 1945, it will end in Europe, and in August of 1945, it will end in the Pacific after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which, of course, is still considered a very controversial decision today. And this leads to America emerging as a global power with really unmatched military and economic strength.
So to recap that really, really quickly, we have a lot of things going on the home front, which the expectation is you're going to be expected to identify how American society fundamentally changes as a result of the war. And then we also need to recognize that America played an important role in ending World War II. But maybe the number one takeaway from the end of the war is that it really will set up the next global conflict, and that will be the Cold War.
So, no longer are we worried about fascism. We are now, the newism of the day is communism. So from 1945 to 1991, the whole cornerstone of our foreign policy was about containment. In a word, you need to remember containment. Containment of what? Communism. That meant the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Vietnam. Domestically, It meant fear, McCarthyism, loyalty oaths, and a culture of conformity.
But during this time, Americans also fought for change. The civil rights movement started as early as, you could say the 1920s into the 30s and into the 40s. But of course, we know it, as really gaining momentum in the 50s. First, with the famous Brown versus the Board of Education decision that desegregated schools, finding that they had not been equal, even though they had been separate. So that reverses, Plessy versus Ferguson from the 1890s. Another key event, the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, which was kicked off by Rosa Parks and others. Another would be the March on Washington in 1963. And then, key changes that came about after this, at least a decade, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which bars discrimination in federal places, and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which gets rid of some of those past unjust things like poll taxes and grandfather clauses.
And as Martin Luther King Jr. would say so eloquently in 1963, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
And to Martin Luther King's point, there will be a number of movements that rise out of the civil rights movement. We've got feminism that will make great strides and become much more active and radical in its protests, with Latin American movement, Chicano movement, Native Americans, the AIM movement, American Indian movement, LGBTQ activism will continue to grow, especially after Stonewall. And increasingly, we have this awareness that environmental issues are slowly becoming more prominent. So environmentalism, the EPA, all of that is happening in this turbulent and transformative time period of the 1960s and 70s.
Dr. Garrison is going to give an introduction to this next segment because he thinks he can do it better than any of us, just so the audience knows.
None of that is true. I think the audience is becoming smart enough and aware enough to know that most of this is just pot stirring by Miss Kellner. So, no, what happened is we really like the phrase "from crisis to conservative turn." That's a great phrase because it helps us understand how the crisis of the 1960s and 70s will lead to this massive conservative turn that reshapes our politics. And I think I just did a really good job of showing that.
You should be like a spokesperson for like a textbook company or something like that.
You should win the Nobel Peace Prize for that intro.
Wow. Okay.
So from let me try to do my best radio voice. Segment 4. From crisis to conservative turn. Boom. I think I did that. Now, talk about crisis. I always think of Vietnam. Vietnam.
Quagmire.
Quagmire. It will really fracture people's trust in the government. But so did Watergate. And the 1970s brought other things like stagflation, the energy crisis, and a sense of malaise.
So enter Ronald Reagan in the election of 1980. And, there really had not been a truly conservative candidate since probably Richard Nixon from his, 1969 to 1974 presidency. And so this conservative wave really reshaped national politics and things that Reagan was really looking to do, tax cuts, which was called deregulation, that those tax cuts to the wealthy would then trickle down to the poorer classes, deregulation of the government, so going back to more of a smaller government emphasis, and then massive military buildup to finally end the Cold War. And so these things, while they are a big change, and there are some successes from this, they do widen wealth gaps, and they really challenge New Deal norms that had been in place since the 1930s.
So quite a moment of change there that we need to reconcile, going from the New Deal coalition that's dominating the 20th century to the new right and the growth of Reaganomics and Reagan's vision for America. But by 1991, the Cold War had ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the United States will stand alone as a global superpower.
So, the dawn of a new millennia. The 2000s brought new trials, the 9/11 attacks, the war on terror that would ensue, and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Homeland security expanded and civil liberties were tested.
And then in 2008, Barack Obama became the first Black president. His election was historic and sparked both hope and backlash. The Affordable Care Act was passed through Congress, same sex marriage legalization came about through a Supreme Court case, and shifting demographics defined the era.
More recently, the United States has faced pretty deep political polarization. A number of racial justice movements, immigration debates, and global crises like climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic have really captured our attention. And it's something that allows us to kind of reflect backward and see how we got here by learning, from all of our past discussions.
So, the story of modern America is still being written, but the key APUSH themes are already there: identity, power, equality, and change.
So here's what we want you to remember from 1920 to the present. It's a big time period, lots of things happening, but let's really focus on cultural and political conflict that will shape the century, economic crisis that would lead to expanded government power, New Deal, New Deal, New Deal. The U.S. is going to emerge as a global leader during World War II and even more so with the Cold War. There'll be ongoing struggles for civil rights, a number of movements that will reshape American society, and the role of government will continue to evolve and evolve and evolve.
Exam questions might ask things like, how did the Cold War shape both U.S. domestic and foreign policy? What sort of changes occurred because of the Cold War, domestically and in foreign policy? How did different groups fight for civil rights? You could possibly see a comparison question about that. And then finally, what are the legacies of Reaganism and post 9/11 America?
So, use landmark legislation, named leaders, and big ideas. Remember, precise, proper nouns make a difference. New Deal, containment, Great Society, Reaganomics, the Patriot Act, Affordable Care Act, and connect them to major CED themes like American identity, politics and power, and America in the world.
Whew, that's it. We covered it all.
Yeah, we did it.
Dang.
We really reviewed everything.
Everything. You guys are ready for this test.
Yeah, you're going to kill it.
So thanks for joining us once more for APUSH for All, our fancy review series. Don't worry, we have more podcasts coming your way after the test. I think we're pretty excited about some of those.
Oh, yeah.
So if you like these episodes, subscribe on Spotify, Apple iTunes, YouTube. Leave us a review. Let us know if you got any questions or topic you want us to cover in future episodes. You can send us a message on Instagram at APUSH for All.
And before I do our usual tagline, I would just like to say a line that I always say to my students. I took this line from the Chiefs head coach, Andy Reid, which that's not my favorite team as it is Extra Hills. Sorry. But he had a great line. And so when you're taking that test, I want you to remember this line. It is, when things look grim, be the grim reaper.
Ooh.
Boom.
Dang. Boom indeed.
Remember that on your test. When things look grim, be the grim reaper.
Maybe we could get one more roar even from Mr. Hill.
Until next time, keep learning from yesterday to make sense of today.